Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and today we're going to be talking about the new Ranger options found in Howl the Wild. Trying to slowly churn out as much of the Howl Wild content as I can before Player Core 2, because that's just going to consume my entire life. And honestly, the Ranger options are really cool. Though I'm very mixed on some of them, so we're going to talk about it here in just a moment, but if you're enjoying this content, leave it a like, and of course, you can always sub if you want to find more, as I'll be talking about all things Pathfinder and Starfinder soon as they come out new and early. But let's go ahead and talk about the Ranger options. So, starting off, we have a few Ranger feats that have been added to the game. First, we have Natural Conduit. Now, this one's actually a really good one, though not necessarily for the Ranger, unless your Ranger happens to be multi-classing into a Spellcaster. So what it does is it's a spell shape, a singular action spell shape, so not a free action one, sadly, but that's completely fine. And you have to have line of effect to your animal companion, which is typically not a bad thing. And as well, they need to be within 60 feet of you. That's a pretty massive range, so all good there. What it does is when you use Natural Conduit as a spell shape, you can cast a spell with your animal companion as the origin point for the spell. This allows you to use some of your closer range spells or a variety of good emanation spells with your animal companion being the focus. Honestly, overall, this is pretty good. There are a variety of really good spells that you can select that having your animal companion be the focus of is honestly a really good thing. And this just gives you more options. Granted, because you're a ranger, it really depends. Rangers are not primarily supposed to be spellcasters of any variety or form. That their kit allows them to have some spellcasting abilities, but this is usually to enhance their other things. So, that being said, it doesn't really seem like spending an action to use this is good more often than not. In fact, it would just be better to command your animal companion and then cast a spell rather than it would be to use a spell that essentially is taking 3 actions more often than not. So, Natural Conduit is better if you're playing a style of Ranger where you want to do a lot more spell casting, or even better if you're a Druid who is taking Ranger multi-class archetypes, or if you're playing dual class, which not a particular style of play I like, but if you're playing dual class, then yeah, Druid Ranger is really good now because you can combine all the great benefits of Animal Companion with some of your spellcasting as Druid. So, really good for multi-class archetyping, not really great for necessarily the Ranger specifically, but it does give you some more options. And if you like spellcasting as a Ranger, then this is a really good feat to pick up. Next up is Animal Strength. Now, this feat in particular is honestly kind of bad. I don't really say a lot of feats are really, I really don't want to say any feats in Pathfinder are really bad, but this one is especially bad in my opinion. So, what's it do? It enhances the animal feature Warden spell. Now, this is an advanced Warden spell that you can select at level 4. And what it does is when you use animal feature to give yourself either the jaw or claw attack, you can now choose a weapon you're carrying and apply all runes from that weapon to the unarmed attack. This replaces any runes with unarmed attacks you might already have, like from Hand Wraps of Mighty Blows. And in addition, when you critically hit with claw or jaw attacks, with the animal feature, you deal an additional d6 persistent bleed damage. Now, honestly, this doesn't sound too bad on the surface, but when you take just a step deeper, you can start seeing a lot of the problems with this one. First of all, you're a ranger. You have access to martial weapons, and there are a lot of really good martial weapons in the game. So, obviously, more often than not, you're going to be using those. The claw attack only just is a d6 with agile and finesse, and the jaw attack is just a jaw attack. It's just a d8 damage, which is not particularly good. Now, if you want to go the claw jaw attack route, that's completely fine. There are a variety of feats, especially added in this book, that apply to those specifically. The problem comes from if that's your main focus as your character, then you're going to get hand wraps and mighty blows to apply this effect for you anyway. Now, obviously, yeah, sure, you could apply different types of runes on different weapons so that you can change up essentially what you're using on your claw and jaw attacks at any one time, which can be good, I suppose. But that's a lot of gold you're spending to give yourself options for something that honestly you could just use those weapons instead of the claw and jaw attack. Like, you have to really work to make animal strength function the way you want it to function, because honestly, why not just use the weapons that you're using the runes off of? What are you using the claw and jaw attacks for? Like I said, there are situations where such attacks do have some benefits, but it feels like a whole lot of nothing just to switch up your runes on your gear when there are much easier ways to do this in the game. So I am going to generally say animal strength is probably a strong one to avoid. There is probably some really good combinations of feats, abilities, or whatever that can make this one work. But I would say on the whole, like if this is just a feat you're thinking of selecting because you like maybe you like the animal feature focus spell, I would probably just avoid it altogether because it's just kind of silly. And with hand wraps and mighty blows, you can already apply rune effects to your unarmed attacks regardless. So it just seems like you're doing a whole lot for not a lot of gain in this one particularly. I don't know. Maybe you guys have some interesting combos. Let me know down in the comments below what you think this could be used for. I would be interested to see. But for me personally, and this does have a really good crit specialization effect, I'll give it that. Which, if you're going the unarmed route, this is actually really good if you're focusing on claws and jaws. But for me personally, this is generally not a great feat. All right, and the last feat we have here is Nature Prowler. This one is actually insanely good. So what it does is, as long as you begin your turn hidden or unnoticed by your hunted prey, that creature is off guard to you until the end of your turn. If you're in natural surroundings, you can avoid notice and even sneak at full speed, but it does not specify hide. So if you're in natural surroundings, you do need cover to hide, but as soon as you're hidden, you can then sneak around at your full speed, which is really good. So I would say in general that this is really solid for any kind of outdoor games. Obviously, there's a lot of campaigns that do take place in natural settings, so this is very solid. But the strong part about this particular feat is, as long as you begin your turn hidden or unnoticed to your hunted prey, they're off guard to you until the end of your turn. Even if you are just invisible, which will just make you hidden, you can attack the enemy. You become visible again unless you have greater invisibility, and they're still off guard to you for the remainder of your attacks. That's really good. There's also so many ways you can become hidden in Pathfinder. Unnoticed is a little bit more difficult, but unnoticed is better for like the initial ambush. So the hidden alone is going to be good enough. And just with a simple hide action, as long as you have some kind of cover, you can become hidden very easily. So Nature Prowler is really, really good. And as long as you're really good at using your environment, this is a very solid feat choice. So now let's go ahead and move on to the Warden spells. Each of the different each of the different Warden levels, Initiate, Advanced, Peerless, and Master, which that was not the right order, but it's fine, got a few extra spells which do expand our repertoire and choices you have when you select each of these feats. So first we're going to start with Distracting Decoy. This is a very interesting one. It targets a creature within 10 feet and it's based on a will save. Now this particular one is very good and very strong. So strong, in fact, I'm surprised it's an Initiate Warden spell. So it's essentially a feint, only much better. When you cast this spell, the creature must make a will save. Now, if they succeed, nothing happens. So this is kind of a save or suck kind of situation. But if they fail, that creature is off guard until the start of your next turn. And I have to add specifically they're off guard to everyone. It's not off guard to you. They're off guard to everyone. That's a -2 AC until the start of your next turn for a singular action. Now, yes, they do have to fail the check, so the fact that a ranger is not the best spellcaster is not really a great thing, but if the enemy doesn't have a great will save, which, rangers are really good at finding those particular saves, then this is an insanely good spell for enemies with low will saves especially. Now, if they crit fail the effect, the creature also takes a -2 circumstance penalty to attacks while it's off guard. So it's at a -2 to its attacks until the start of your next turn, essentially, which is really good. So Distracting Decoy, insanely good. A single action for essentially a better feint is really good because honestly, feint also doesn't do anything if you fail. So, or if the enemy succeeds, rather. So that being the case, I guess it's if you fail or this one succeeds. It's very weird. This is a really good one. I would say this is very good for support. And honestly, like this is such a good one. I would find ways for other classes to pick this one up just because of how good it is. If you just have that extra action available in a focus point, yeah, just this is really, really good. Next up, we have Keen Smell. I've always kind of dubious when it comes to imprecise senses in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Keen Smell plays really much into that. So essentially, for the next minute, you gain a imprecise scent of 30 feet, and your hunted prey can't become undetected by you as long as it's within your scent range. And at 3rd rank, this spell goes to 60 feet instead. Imprecise senses are just something that, like, if the creature isn't doing anything to hide its scent, more or less, then it really can't do more than be concealed to you for all intents and purposes. It's easier to detect them. You can smell them no matter what. If they're invisible, something is there. They're no longer hidden to you. It's decent, but and to be fair, this is a focus spell, so you got a focus point, boom, put it on, and then the creature that just turned invisible in the scene is now not nearly as, I guess, invisible to you, which is very solid. I would prefer if this did something like, gave you a precise sense of smell. That feels like a lot more worth the value, but the scent stuff is okay. It's generally decent in the situation. Would I spend a feat to select Keen Smell? Probably not. I would probably select something else like Distracting Decoy, which I just spoke about. But depending on the style of character and the story you want to tell, Keen Smell might be really good. So overall, it's okay. And the best part is, since it's a focus point and it lasts for a minute, you get this effect pretty easy and you can get it as you need it rather than depending on having it all the time. So, not a bad one, a decent one to keep on hand, but I would probably select some other focus spells from the Initiate Warden spells first before I would select Keen Smell. The last Initiate spell we have is Slime Spit. Now, this one is 2 actions and it has a range of 30 feet. It's based on a reflex saving throw, and essentially you hacks toxic goo right into an enemy's face. It does 2d6 poison damage with, damage based on a basic reflex saving throw, where if they succeed, they take half, but they're dazzled on success, which is really cool. Now, they can remove this dazzled effect by wiping the goo from their eyes as a interact action, but essentially, it's either the enemy is dazzled for a round, or the enemy has to spend an action effectively making this either dazzle or slow on success. That's insanely good. And 2d6 poison damage is not terrible for a first rank focus spell. And I should say every time it heightens, it goes up by an additional 2d6. So again, not too bad. Now, obviously, it's a reflex saving throw. So if an enemy has their high save and reflex, you want to be careful because your saves are not necessarily as high as a spellcaster's. But still, even just the success effect, like, it's still hard for enemies to get a crit success on them or to get a crit success on your spell. So I do say that this is really good. Just the success effect. On failure, they take the full damage and they're just dazzled until the end of your next turn, which is insanely good. And then crit failing, they take double damage and then they're blinded for a round and then dazzled until they spend an interact action to wipe it from their eyes. So the crit fail, not likely to happen, but still can happen, does a good amount of damage, blinds the enemy for a round with nothing they can do, and then they still need to spend an interact action to get rid of dazzled, or they're dazzled for essentially the rest of the fight, which is incredibly solid. So yeah, Slime Spit is genuinely pretty good. Now, again, this is kind of one of those situations where, is this what a ranger should be doing? Should a ranger be focusing on spell casting more or less rather than any of their actual martial actions, which they are honestly more proficient in? I would have to say Slime Spit, I think, is good because it has the added benefits of making the enemy dazzled, even on success, which can give you all kinds of different opportunities. So yeah, I would say Slime Spit is really good. I don't know how I feel about general ranger spellcasting builds, but because these are focus points, you honestly can't do these too much in a fight anyway. Granted, most fights don't last that long, so you could technically use Slime Spit if you had enough focus points every round that most battles would last. That I don't think is a good situation. But if you pair this with other features, other with your teammates or whatever, I think Slime Spit is a really good choice. I know Ranger spellcasting is always kind of dubiously held in the Pathfinder community. I appreciate it, and I appreciate what these spells have to offer. But I do admit as well, the Ranger is a Ranger. They're a martial class first and foremost. The spellcasting should be something that helps them rather than be the focus of the class. I think Slime Spit can help them. And something like Distracting Decoy works a lot more perfectly because it has, only a singular action. Choose what works best for you. Just understand that Rangers are not the best spellcasters. So you need to implement these predominantly with other actions you're doing to get the most out of them rather than relying on these to do the heavy lifting in combat for you. Just my general opinion. And I will say, because this doesn't have the attack trait, you can Slime Spit someone and attack at your full attack ability, which is really solid. So overall, really good. Next, we have the Advanced Warden spells. These you can select at level 4. And first, we have Canopy Crawler. Now, this is a creature it's a buff spell that you can target a creature within range of touch. And the targets can only be yourself or your animal companion. So you can't even give this to your allies. It lasts for 10 minutes. And what it does is it essentially gives you a climb speed equal to your highest speed, which is a very interesting verbiage here. Your highest speed, which could be something other than, like, if you are one of the ancestries that has like a really, really good swim speed in addition to a pretty okay land speed, you can get a really good climb speed, which is very solid. Now, the target can climb with a hand occupied, so this really helps those situations where climbing in Pathfinder is tedious, to say the least. Because you have to stow your weapons, which is an action per weapon, then climb, which is never very fast unless you have a climb speed in this situation. Even if you have a climb speed, you still can't have anything in your hands typically, unless it's a spell like this that allows you to have at least something in your hand, or both your hands can be occupied if you have Combat Climber. And then when you get to the top of the thing, you normally would have to draw weapons. Canopy Crawler solves a lot of those issues. So honestly, if you're playing in a game where your GM really likes to play with height as a factor in combat, Canopy Crawler is really good and sometimes a must-take spell. If it's that common, you definitely are going to want to do this. And when you hit fifth rank with this particular spell, its duration increases to an hour, which is insane because it's a focus spell. And you can target both yourself and your animal companion with a single casting. So Canopy Crawler is honestly really good. There's so many situations you can use this inside and outside of combat. And because it's a focus spell with a duration longer than a minute, it's super efficient. You can, I mean, obviously 10 minutes is how much time it takes to refocus. But because you can set this up before a combat situation, for instance, you can effectively have your remaining focus points available and not spend the actions in combat. I really like Canopy Crawler. I think it's just useful in so many different ways. Next up, we have Imitate Fauna. And this is the most puzzling focus spell I think I've ever seen. And it raises an interesting question, because awakened animals have the trait Awakened Animal, and the target for this one, let's start with the spell. So Imitate Fauna is a 2-action focus spell that has a duration of an hour that targets one willing animal. Now, some of you pedantic people out there might be like, well, people are animals too. Not in Pathfinder, they're not. Animal is a trait. Players typically, and everything, has traits. Very few, and in fact, 0 player characters currently have the animal traits. And Awakened Animal, it can be argued that Awakened Animal is its own thing. I would say this would work on an Awakened Animal. It makes a lot of sense, but who knows? Who knows? Because the rules is written, Awakened Animal seems like its own unique trait, which means it's not the same as animal as a trait. I don't know. What does this even do, right? What's the whole point of this one? Well, you use your nature prowess, I guess. It has an illusion, but it really goes to emphasize that this isn't magic you're using, even though it kind of is. You take the animal, and this animal changes its overall appearance, its scent, its voice, and this allows the target to communicate with other members of the species that it has essentially been transformed into. So essentially, you're taking an animal and you're changing it to look like another animal for the express purpose of allowing it to speak and communicate with these animals. Now, during this time, they can speak with the animals of the same species as if they share the same language, but they can't speak other languages while the spell persists. So whatever information your ally, I guess, in the situation is getting, they can't communicate to you unless you have the ability to speak to animals. And this counts as setting up a disguise for the express purpose of impersonating a animal of the particular fauna that your animal friend, I guess, is being changed into. And so it gives them a +4 status bonus to deception checks to prevent other animals from seeing through the disguise. And hey, guess what? When this heightens, you can target 6 animals as well. What's the point of this spell? I mean, I guess familiars can have the animal trait, and so this is where it can effectively be this looks like it's really, really good with the use of a familiar more than anything. But animals are not typically that smart, so even the higher bonus to deception might not be necessary. This only targets animals, so you have to have an animal that you can properly communicate with to have them then go incognito to disguise to go deal with an animal companion. Sure, you can have your animal companion do this, but the interesting thing about animal companions, you actually can't really communicate with them unless you have the ability to speak to animals. So even if your animal companion does understand you and can follow some basic commands you can give it, it's not that smart. This just feels like a situation where the players are trying to use this with their animal companion or something with the GM, and they're trying to have a very low intelligence conversation between 2 animals for the players to learn something general. And I feel like typically there are way better ways to do this than spending a focus point and using this particular focus spell. I don't know. Because it targets only animals specifically, it's well, in some party comps, this one's just not even going to work. And if you have an animal companion, then one, you're already competing feats between your warden spells and your animal companion feats, unless you're using free archetype, and then it's a little bit more understandable. And for what? So animals can tell you, oh yeah, there's this guy who smelled like a perfume who came through here not too long ago. I mean, heck, even keen smell might just like you could have the GM be like, okay, maybe your keen smell improves your chances on detecting the scent of this individual who had come through here like an hour ago or something like that. Like, Imitate Fauna is just really goofy, and I feel like there's just much better versions of this spell in the game. I Granted, it's a focus spell, which can be helpful, but I don't know. And because it only targets animals, I feel like there's just so much room for error in this particular focus spell that I can't say it's a good one, unfortunately. Sure, could you use it? Could you ingenuitively use it as an individual? Sure. But for like everyone, I don't know. And like, there are probably just better people or situation. I feel like your feet choice should be spent elsewhere rather than taking Imitate Fauna. What can I say? Next, we move up to Master Warden spells. We have Threatening Mimicry, and these you can select at level 6, by the way. So Threatening Mimicry is a 10-foot emanation, essentially fear effect. It has a defense of a will save, and this targets specifically non-allied creatures in the area. Non-allied is very interesting. You don't see this particular phrasing much in the game, but this means not only your enemies, but even, passerbys or any kind of neutral characters in the scene can be affected by this as well. So you do need to be kind of careful about this situation. But technically, this also means that you can use this in settings where other characters who aren't hostile to you can be affected by this, as spells that target enemies don't necessarily target neutral characters. Interesting. There might be ways to use this, but overall, it's an area fear effect. It's pretty decent, if I do say so myself, because even on success, the creature is frightened 1, and this condition doesn't decrease at the end of its turn if it damaged you during that turn. So this makes creatures way less likely to target you with attacks, because doing so perpetuates this fear, which is not only affecting their attacks, but is also affecting their defenses and other abilities as well. So when you use this, whatever you're using this on is probably going to back off and not attack you, which is, I think, overall the intent. That's what like a threatening pose against a bear. You're not doing this so you can get an advantage on the bear on your, for when the bear backs up. You're doing this so the bear won't attack you, and this makes a lot of sense. And because this only works on damages, there's a chance that a frightened creature striking you and missing still will allow that fear to go away because they didn't damage you. Kind of silly. But if they fail the save anyway, it's all the same stuff, but Frightened 2, and Crit Fail is all the same stuff, but Frightened 3. So overall, Threatening Mimicry does exactly what it... Like, I love how Paizo has made a focus spell here that works exactly as intended for what your character is doing. Threatening Mimicry is not a fear effect ability innately. What it is you're trying to prevent creatures from attacking you further, because attacking you further is bad for them. And so you're going up, you're trying to look big, you're trying to push them off of you, and it works essentially mechanically just like that. That's really, really cool. And of course, obviously, this just works as a really good area demoralize, only it's better than demoralize because the enemies don't become immune to it afterwards. So overall, I really like Threatening Mimicry. It's a very solid focus spell, very good to have in your kit. And if you like getting into the thick of combat, this can be really good. And hey, if you have the natural conduit feats that we talked about earlier, you can use Threatening Mimicry as with your animal companion being the focus to get enemies off of your animal companion. So even bigger bonuses if you're combining the two. Overall, I have nothing bad to say about this one. This is an insanely good focus spell. Next up, we have Warning Stripes, also a very defensive-based focus spell, but this one's only an action, and it lasts for a minute. So what you do is, as a singular action, you can give yourself aposomatic swirls, if you know what that is, to warn other creatures that you're toxic. Any creature that touches you or hits you with an unarmed melee attack takes 2d8 poison damage. If you have an animal companion, this spell can be cast on them with a range of 30 feet. Now, every 2 ranks, so every odd rank essentially after this one, the spell's damage increases by an additional d8. I love thorn damages in game. Poison is not the best for thorns in general because, there's a decent amount of creatures that are just immune to poison or resistant to poison, but there are a lot that necessarily aren't. It's not like D&D 5e where like everything in its mother has immunity to poison. So, Warding Stripes is really good. A singular action, you set yourself up pretty much for the combat to deal poison damage against any creature that just has unarmed attacks that's using against you, or creatures that want to grapple you, for instance, is very, very good. So overall, I'm very happy with it. And the damage is pretty okay, honestly, because it's every time it happens, even though the damage isn't particularly high, that constant danger is going to make you very unappealing to any creatures that have unarmed strikes or whatever, effectively making this a good defensive spell more than anything. So I really like this one. It's the same thing with threatening mimicry. They both do essentially what they would do in nature. You look big to scare animals away. You look like you're poisonous so animals don't try to eat you. Plain and simple, and it works. Finally, we're moving on to the Peerless Warden spells. First, we have Gluttonous Growth. I really like this one, but this one is very situational. So it has a range of 120 feet, and it affects all squares in a 20-foot burst that contains plants. And it can be sustained up to a minute. The biggest thing about this one is you cause all the plants in that 20-foot burst to begin growing. Now, the great thing about this is the area becomes difficult terrain, which is good, and it works on both flying and ground creatures, or ground and flying creatures. That's the part I should emphasize. It works on creatures in the sky as well, which is crazy. And each creature that begins its turn in the area must then make a reflex save or against your spell DC, or be grabbed or even restrained. Now, on crit success, nothing happens, but even on success, the creature is grabbed until the beginning of its next turn, or it escapes. Now, the escape DC will be your spell DC, so, a lot of creatures will probably be able to easily break out of this, especially because a lot of creatures have pretty decent athletics, but not necessarily always the case. And so on success, the creatures are grabbed. So not only does it create difficult terrain, but if an animal or if a creature is already in like one of these areas that are going to be affected, then they have a very high chance of not being able to move, or at least forcing them to spend an action to be able to move. And if it's a particularly dense area, then they're going to have to deal with the difficult terrain they have to move through. That's insane. It's so good. On success alone, this is insanely good. Now, on failure, the creature is grabbed until the spell ends or it escapes. That's also really good. So it has to make the escape check or it's just not going to go anywhere. And on a crit failure, it's restrained until it escapes. Now, the best part about this is you can then choose to sustain this every round. And when you sustain this spell, oh, no, I'm sorry, not even every round. My bad. You can just use the sustain action as much as you want. So when you sustain this spell, each creature grabbed or restrained by the plants takes 4d6 piercing damage. I don't think they understood how powerful this is, because you can sustain a spell. Yeah, you can sustain this spell multiple times in a round. As long as the creature is currently grabbed, they just take an unblockable, because there's no save, 4d6 piercing damage, which is like at level 10, right? As long as the creature fails its save and doesn't break out in time, your next turn, you can sustain it 3 times, doing 12d6 damage. And every spell rank increase makes this go up an additional 2d6 damage when you sustain it. And for those of you who are like, that's not how it works in the game, I'll read it for you from the book itself. So, an effect might list an additional benefit that occurs if you sustain it, and this can even appear on the effects that don't have a sustained duration. If the effect has both a special benefit and a sustained duration, your sustain action extends the duration as well as having the special benefit. And in addition to this, I'll also mark sustaining a spell more than once in the same turn doesn't extend the duration of to subsequent turns. There's nothing in here that says that you can't sustain it multiple times in a round. The only thing that doesn't happen is it doesn't extend the duration, which, is fine because you're just going to be like, all right, boom, 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 take a bunch of piercing damage, and it's just one more round that I can do this again. Now, I will say that there is decent counterplay because creatures aren't grabbed until they start their turn, and it's based on that reflex saving throw. So if they're not grabbed and they make it out of the area, it's over. But if they start their turn, are grabbed, and don't free themselves, then they're vulnerable to being hit by this. There is a ton of counterplay. Don't get my whole sustain thing to mean that it is like an overpowered spell. One, plants already have to be in the area of the 20-foot burst. So the enemy needs to be already positioned. In addition, this can't be even effective until the enemy at least starts their turn, and then the enemy doesn't break free and move out of the affected area. And even if they do break free and fail to leave the area, they're still not considered grabbed and still can't take that damage. What I'm saying is, if you ever get to have a turn where an enemy is grabbed by this particular spell, they take a ton of damage, which is really good. This is a terrifying spell. There's a fair amount of counterplay. It is somewhat situational, but if it gets off, this is a very devastating spell effect, probably one of the strongest that you can get as a ranger, especially. So Gluttonous Growth is very good. Next up, we have Pack Breaker. This one's a very interesting one. This has a range of 30 feet, and it targets a singular creature. It is 2 actions, and it lasts for a minute. Not sustained, so you don't have to worry about sustaining this one. So you target this creature, and it's essentially the effect of Paranoia. That creature, the affected creature, if they fail the will save, or even if they succeed the will save, which we'll get to that in a moment, will treat their allies as enemies. They suspect their allies as having changed allegiance depending on the outcome of their will save. And regardless of the effects of the saving throw, the creature is then immune to Pack Breaker for an hour. So it's kind of a one and done type of spell. But if the enemy succeeds the save, this is if they succeed the save, mind you, for the next minute, the creature becomes unfriendly to all creatures to which it wasn't already hostile, and even those that were previously its allies. It treats no one as an ally for 1 minute. Each of its former allies within its reach must attempt a save against Pack Breaker. So if a bunch of enemies are grouped together, even though technically Pack Breaker only targets a creature, you can affect every creature that creature is adjacent to or is within its reach when you do so. That is insane. That's a huge propagation type of effect, and it makes a lot of sense. It's very, very interesting. It's also, by the way, nothing that should ever be used against players. This is absolutely terrible if a GM has an enemy ranger that uses this against a player group, because this takes away a bunch of agency from whoever the target is. So that being in mind, pretty interesting. Now, obviously, they don't treat them as allies, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're hostile to each other either. They just become unfriendly, which, means they're still hostile to your group typically in this situation. So they'll still prefer to attack you. They just aren't going to work together. So something to keep in mind. But the insane part about this one is the failure, because it does all the same things as success, but the creature is also confused for a round. Now, on an individual level, that's not too bad. But when you consider the fact that every creature within the initial creature's reach also has to make a save against this spell, you can essentially mass confuse a bunch of enemies depending on the situation, which is insanely good. Now, they're only confused for a round on failure, which does bring back a little bit of the power of this, but still insanely powerful. And on crit failure, it's same effect, but the creature's confused for a minute. So yeah, Pack Breaker is really, really good. The best part about this one is the enemies are gonna no longer work together, and any effects like if they have a buffer, for instance, like an enemy that wants to buff their allies with spells or whatever, they're just not gonna do it if they're affected by this spell. So I like Pack Breaker. I think it's really, really good. It's a very solid ability and something you can quickly throw in some very niche situations, but I do think it's very, very good. And the last focus spell we have here kind of just makes you into a Magus. It's very interesting. So essentially, the target is one creature within reach. You have to hit them with a strike for this one. It's 2 actions, and it creates an area 15 cone. So what happens is you strike a creature with a melee strike. If you hit, that strike does an additional 3d8 sonic damage to that creature. Now, regardless of whether the strike actually hits or not, that creature becomes a point of origin for a 15-foot cone behind them, directly away from you anyway. All creatures within that cone then must make a basic fort save against 6d8 sonic damage. And every spell rank that this goes up, it goes up by another d8. So it's really good because not only is this a decent area effect, it also just amplifies the use of a strike. Your strike does essentially more damage, and depending on the type of weapon you are, this is technically better than power attack. Granted, it uses a focus point. So you strike an enemy for 2 actions, and you do 3d8 more damage if you hit. Really solid, and regardless, it does a big cone behind them, damaging any creature behind them, making it really good for grouped up enemies. Even if there isn't grouped up enemies, I find Pulverizing Wake to be insanely powerful because a singular strike just does 3d8 more damage, and it increases every even level for the player essentially to do an additional d8 damage. Or no, sorry, every odd level after the time you would select this one. Every spell rank, how about that, that you would have this one would do an extra d8 damage, making this scale very well into the late game, do a lot of damage. Sonic damage also not very often resisted, not very often immune to, and very good. So yeah, Pulverizing Wake is a very solid effect. And honestly, I wish you could select this on a Magus. You could technically at level 20, I suppose, but that's a lot of investment for this. Yeah, this particular one really good, and honestly, the Ranger spells in general are really good. Ranger always sits in a very odd situation when it comes to their Warden spells because they're not primary spellcasters. So a lot of the times they're better off using these actions in tandem with like a strike or something like that. And oftentimes that does work really well rather than, as long as you're not flurry, these are really good. You're doing outwit, very solid choices oftentimes because you can use one of these effects and still strike in the same turn, kind of getting both the benefits of spellcasting and being a martial character. I like it. I like a lot of these. I think a lot of these are really good, even though some of them I felt were not particularly good, overly niche, or particularly stinkers. I do think overall these options are really good. And for the Rangers who really want to have that Warden aesthetic, this is what you were waiting for. This was the book that you were waiting for. So, you know, great for all the Warden players out there. I am really happy that you guys got a lot of good options. And honestly, Ranger as a whole was made better with this, with some of these features as well. So I think that overall, the Ranger stuff gets a big thumbs up from me. But that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me. And I'll see y'all next time. Bye.